When the HOA bulldozed through my family's wetlands to build their private shortcut, I warned them nature would fight back. Months later, the sky turned black. The rain came down in torrents, and by sunrise, everything the HOA had built was gone, swallowed by the flood they created with their own arrogance. Subscribe for more real stories where karma doesn't need revenge. It just waits for the right storm. I never imagined the place I call home, a quiet, green stretch of land along the Willow Creek wetlands, would become a battleground. For decades, my family had protected those acres. My father planted every tree by hand. My mother cataloged every migrating bird that nested by the water. It wasn't just land. It was a living memory, breathing, fragile, and sacred. But when the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association expanded their development down the road, my wetlands became their next project. They called it community enhancement. I called it theft. It began with survey flags. Thin red ribbons appeared along my fence line one morning, slicing through the cattails and reeds like scars. I remember crouching down to look at one, the ink still fresh. Phase 4 expansion. I didn't know it then, but those words would mark the beginning of a disaster that no one could stop. At first, the HOA president, a polished man named Richard Hanley, tried to charm his way in. He spoke in smooth, empty promises. We'll raise property values. We'll improve access. We'll respect the environment. But buried beneath those phrases was greed. He wanted a direct road to my property to connect the new subdivision to the highway, a shortcut that would save the developers money and make the HOA look like heroes. I refused, firmly. My wetlands weren't for sale. They were federally protected, part of a fragile ecosystem that filtered floodwaters and sheltered dozens of species. I showed them the conservation documents. I quoted the environmental acts. But Hanley just smiled like a man who already owned the world. Weeks later, the trucks came. Bulldozers, excavators, and contractors arrived one humid morning while I was at work. By the time I got home, the once lush stretch of tall grass and willow saplings was a muddy wasteland. They had cut a path, a long, ugly gash through the wetlands, to pour asphalt over what used to be water channels. I stood there, speechless, my boots sinking into the churned mud as engines roared in the distance. The HOA claimed it was temporary access, that they were simply testing the ground. But that lie didn't hold for long. Within a week, concrete barriers were installed, rebar laid out, and heavy machinery hummed day and night. They weren't testing. They were building. I filed complaints to the county, the EPA, even the local newspaper. But Maple Ridge's HOA had money and connections. They argued that their eco-friendly elevated road wouldn't harm the wetlands. They even produced fake environmental studies stamped with forged signatures. Every night, I watched from my porch as the wetlands died a little more. The frogs went silent first. Then the herons stopped coming. The water turned from clear to murky brown. The road rose higher, cutting off the natural flow of the creek. Then came the rain. That summer was one of the wettest on record. Every forecast predicted storms, and the wetlands, once a natural sponge for floodwaters, were now sealed beneath layers of compacted soil and asphalt. Water had nowhere to go. I tried to warn them. I wrote letters, recorded videos, even attended HOA meetings. But Hanley mocked me publicly, calling me a doomed prophet. He said their engineers had planned for everything, but they hadn't planned for nature's patience. The first rail storm came in late August. It started with a steady drizzle, then a downpour. By midnight, the sound of rain was deafening. I stood on my porch watching water pour down the new road like a river, pooling at the base where the wetlands once absorbed it. The ditches overflowed, small whirlpools forming where drainage should have been. I grabbed my flashlight and waded out, the beam flickering against sheets of rain. The asphalt gleamed under the storm, slick, black, defiant. And then I saw it, a deep crack forming across the new road, spreading like lightning. By morning, the road was buckling. The culverts the HOA had installed couldn't handle the surge. The water forced its way up, seeping through cracks, breaking through concrete. Cars were trapped. Yards flooded. Hanley blamed freak weather. But I knew better. The wetlands weren't gone. They were fighting back. Over the next week, more rain came. The water table rose. The ground beneath the road began to shift, softening the foundation. The HOA brought in more equipment, more barriers, trying desperately to hold back what they didn't understand. Then one night, around 2 a.m., I woke to low rumble, not thunder, but something deeper, heavier. I stepped outside, and the sight froze me in place. A section of a new highway, almost half a mile long, was collapsing into the wetlands. Asphalt, soil, and concrete slabs were sliding downward, swallowed by the earth they'd violated. Streetlights flickered, sparks flying as power lines snapped. The sound was terrifying, like the land itself was screaming. And through the chaos, I could see Hanley's prized community road, vanishing beneath the floodwater. The same water he said could never rise again. But that was only the beginning, because the storm wasn't over, and what came next would wash away everything the HOA had ever built. By dawn, the storm had slowed to a gray drizzle, but the damage was unmistakable. The once pristine neighborhood of Maple Ridge now looked like a disaster zone. Streetlights leaned at broken angles. Mailboxes were half submerged. Cars had drowned in murky brown water. And where the HOA's new highway once stood, there was nothing but a jagged scar of collapsed earth and debris. I walked toward it slowly, boots sinking into the soft, sucking mud. The smell of wet asphalt and rotting vegetation filled the air. The sound of frogs had returned, cautious but defiant, croaking from the edges of the broken road. The wetlands, it seemed, were reclaiming what was theirs. But the HOA saw something different. To them, this wasn't nature taking back balance. It was a threat to their image, their profits, their control. By the time the sun broke through the clouds, Hanley and a small army of board members were already on site. Their suits were soaked, their polished shoes ruined, but they stood there barking orders like generals at a battlefield. Construction trucks lined the streets. Workers with clipboards took pictures. Someone shouted about insurance claims. When Hanley saw me, his face tightened. He didn't say a word, but his glare carried everything: blame, fury, fear. I could almost hear his thoughts. If we admit fault, we lose everything. Within hours, the HOA launched its cover-up. They called it a localized erosion event. They said unexpected weather patterns caused the damage, not their illegal construction. Press releases went out to local news outlets. Statements were drafted. A PR team even filmed Hanley standing in front of the destruction, promising residents that repairs will begin immediately and the community will come back stronger. Stronger. The word made me sick, because I knew what those repairs meant. More machinery, more soil dumping, more suffocation for what was left of the wetlands. So I did what I always did. I documented everything. I took photos of the cracks, the water levels, the dead fish that had washed up near the broken culverts. I recorded videos of the mudslides and posted them online. My small YouTube channel, once ignored, suddenly went viral. People began to notice. Environmental groups reached out. Journalists called. Hanley's lies were unraveling, but he didn't back down. Instead, he doubled down. The HOA hired a private contractor, not a restoration team, but a heavy construction firm known for quick, dirty fixes. Within days, they brought in dump trucks full of gravel, concrete slabs, and steel beams. They worked day and night to rebuild the road, this time higher, wider, stronger. They even put up fences around the area to block me from recording. But I didn't need to get close to see what was happening. From my back porch, I watched as they filled in the last remaining pools of the wetlands. The same pools where I used to see herons wade and dragonflies shimmer in the sunlight. It was painful, like watching a loved one being buried alive. Then came the letters. The HOA sent me official notices claiming my property's drainage was contributing to the flood issue. They accused me of neglecting storm management responsibilities. They even threatened legal action, try and make it seem like the disaster was my fault. The audacity stunned me. They destroyed my land, built without permission, and now they were turning me into the villain. But I refused to be silenced. I spent nights combing through county archives, finding proof of the conservation easement my father had signed decades ago. I contacted an environmental attorney, a quiet but relentless woman named Laura Pike, who had made a career fighting corporate land violations. When I showed her the photos, the permits, and the flood maps, her expression hardened. "They didn't just break zoning laws," she said. "They violated federal environmental protection acts. If we can prove this, it's criminal." That word, criminal, gave me a spark of hope. We filed an injunction against the HOA, demanding an immediate halt to construction and a full environmental assessment. The news spread quickly. Local reporters began circling. Residents grew uneasy. Some whispered that Hanley had cut backroom deals with county inspectors. Others feared property values would plummet. The pressure was building, and Hanley knew it. So he fought back the only way he knew how: intimidation. One evening, as I drove home from work, I noticed a black SUV parked at the end of my driveway. Two men sat inside, silhouettes behind tinted glass. They didn't move. When I stopped my truck, the SUV rolled forward slowly, then drove off without a word. The message was clear. That night, I couldn't sleep. Rain began again, soft at first, then harder, like an echo of what was coming. I looked out across the dark fields, the rebuilt highway rising like a scar above the waterlogged ground. The wetlands shimmered faintly in the lightning flashes, their edges glowing silver. I could almost feel them breathing. Something deep inside me whispered that this wasn't over. The next morning, Laura called. "The judge approved the injunction," she said. "Construction must stop immediately." It was a small victory, temporary, fragile, but it felt like justice. For a moment, until that afternoon, when an anonymous source leaked an internal HOA document to the press. It was an engineering report, one the HOA had buried months ago. It warned that their highway's foundation sat on unstable soil, that further rainfall could cause catastrophic structural failure. The date on the report? 3 months before the first flood. Hanley had known. The scandal exploded. News vans arrived. Reporters swarmed Maple Ridge. Residents demanded answers. But the skies were already darkening again. Another storm system, larger than the last, was forming over the valley. The meteorologists called it the 100-year storm. And this time, the wetlands had no defense left. The highway, the homes, the arrogance, all stood directly in nature's path. The air grew heavy. The frogs went silent again. And as the first drops of rain began to fall, I knew that this was no longer just a battle over land. It was retribution. The first drops began like whispers against the leaves, soft, rhythmic, harmless. By evening, those whispers became a roar. Sheets of rain lashed against rooftops. Wind howled to the broken trees, and thunder rolled over the valley like an approaching war drum. I stood by the window, flashlight in hand, staring out at what was once my family's wetlands. The new HOA highway, raised higher than before, now stood like a dark, gleaming wall slicing through the landscape. Water pooled at its base, already beginning to swell. It was only the beginning. The local weather alerts buzzed on my phone. Severe flood warning. Evacuation recommended for low-lying areas. I knew exactly what that meant. My home, and every one of the Maple Ridge houses built along that highway, was now part of the low-lying area. I could see the HOA's arrogance rising like the water itself. Hours before the storm intensified, Hanley had gone door to door, assuring residents everything was under control. He'd hired an emergency team to stack sandbags along the road, as if a few piles of burlap could hold back nature's fury. He wanted control, but nature was already beyond it. By midnight, the rain showed no mercy. The wind drove it sideways, hammering against my windows so hard that the glass shuddered. Power flickered, then died completely. The world outside dissolved into blackness, broken only by lightning flashes that illuminated the chaos for split seconds at a time. Toppled mailboxes, swirling water, tree branches flying like spears. I lit a lantern, its glow trembling against the walls. In its faint light, I could see my father's old photographs, the wetlands in their prime, birds in flight, reeds bending gently in the wind, the reflection of the sky perfectly mirrored in still water. It all felt like another lifetime. Then came the sound, deep, guttural, and endless, the sound of water breaking free. I ran to the porch, rain hitting my face like shards of ice. Through the storm, I saw it. The new highway beginning to crack again. Water was pouring over it, no longer following its intended channels. The pressure had built behind it, trapped and raging. It was no longer a road. It was a dam. And dams don't last forever. The wetlands, buried beneath layers of soil and asphalt, were rising up again. Water, desperate for escape, began tearing through the weakest points. The culverts, too narrow, too shallow, buckled first. Then came the embankments, sliding down in torrents of mud and broken concrete. I could hear shouting in the distance, voices carried by the wind. Residents were trying to flee. Cars stalled in knee-deep water. The streetlights sparked and went dark one by one. The entire neighborhood was sinking. The air was electric with panic. I grabbed my raincoat and flashlight, wading out into the chaos. The water was already waist-deep in some places. Debris floated past. Pieces of fences, children's toys, a patio chair. The rain made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead, but the roaring sound of rushing water guided me. When I reached the edge of the new road, I saw the full scope of it. The central section, the one the HOA rebuilt, was collapsing again, only this time much worse. The soil beneath it had liquefied. The floodwaters from upstream were funneling directly into the valley, and without the wetlands to absorb them, the water had nowhere to go but through the heart of Maple Ridge. Lightning illuminated the horror in a split-second flash. Cars overturned, people standing on rooftops, shouting into the storm. The highway, once a proud symbol of progress, was now a broken line disappearing beneath the flood. I tried call for help, but there was no signal. Emergency lines were down. The county's resources were stretched thin. Other parts of the region were flooding too. This wasn't just a local disaster anymore. It was a regional catastrophe, all connected by one thing: the destroyed wetlands. The irony was unbearable. As I fought my way back home, I saw Hanley himself, soaked, frantic, his pristine HOA jacket clinging to him like a second skin. He was shouting into a radio, trying to coordinate rescue crews that would never come in time. The man who had mocked nature now stood powerless before it. He noticed me through the rain. His face twisted, not in anger this time, but terror. He pointed toward the far end of the road where the creek had once flowed freely. In that moment, I understood what he saw. The water had found a way through. A massive surge was coming. The pent-up floodwaters from miles upstream, finally breaking through the barriers they had built. It moved like a living thing, black and unstoppable, carrying trees, debris, and entire chunks of pavement in its path. I shouted for him to run, but the sound of the flood drowned out everything. Seconds later, the surge hit. The wall of water crashed through the half-collapsed highway with a thunderous crack that shook the ground beneath my feet. I watched in horror as Hanley was swept off his feet, disappearing into the torrent. The lights, the machines, the construction, all of it vanished beneath the churning brown flood. It was over in minutes. By dawn, the rain stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable, the kind that only comes after destruction. The air smelled of mud and diesel and loss. When the first rescue teams arrived hours later, they found Maple Ridge unrecognizable. Homes were gone, roads erased. The wetlands, though still submerged, were beginning to show signs of life again. Water birds circling overhead, reeds peeking through the silt. I sat on my porch steps, soaked and exhausted, watching the sun rise over a landscape reborn through chaos. What the HOA had built in greed, nature had erased in justice. And as I looked out over Flooded Valley, I realized something. The wetlands hadn't been destroyed. They had merely been waiting for the right storm. But as relief workers moved through the ruins, collecting what was left, whispers began to spread among them that not everything washed away in a flood had been found. And among the missing was Richard Hanley. For 2 days, rescue teams searched through what was left of Maple Ridge. Helicopters hovered above the flooded neighborhood, their rotors slicing through the humid air. Boats glided over what used to be streets, now turned into brown rivers. From above, it looked less like a community and more like a broken reflection of one. Rooftops jutting to the water, fragments of lives scattered like driftwood. I hadn't slept since the night of the flood. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the roar again, the cracking asphalt, the screaming wind, and Hanley's figure vanishing into the torrent. The memory haunted me, but there was something else too, an unease that wouldn't go away. Hanley was missing, yes, but so was the HOA's entire record of permits, documents, and project files. Their office building, which sat on slightly higher ground, had been ripped apart by the flood. Computers gone. Cabinets washed away. It was as if nature had erased every trace of their corruption in one clean sweep, or almost every trace. Because 3 days later, as the floodwater began to recede, something surfaced. I was out helping one of the volunteer crews when a shout echoed from the far side of the collapsed highway. "We got something," a rescuer yelled. Everyone stopped. The air seemed to thicken as they waded toward the edge of the murky water. And then we saw it, a piece of fabric tangled in branches. It took only moments to realize what it was. A man's jacket, Hanley's jacket. When they pulled the body from the water, it was barely recognizable. His ID confirmed it, though no one needed proof. The one slick HOA president was gone. His reign ended not by legal action or public shame, but by the very land he had desecrated. The news spread fast. Some residents mourned. Others whispered that it was karma. The HOA immediately went silent, their remaining board members scattering like ghosts. No one wanted to be associated with what they now called the Willow Creek collapse. But something about Hanley's death didn't sit right with me. Yes, the flood had been massive. Yes, the destruction was beyond anyone's control. But the body, the way it was found, told a different story. His hands were bound with what looked like torn electrical cable, and his jacket pockets were stuffed with paper, soggy blueprints, bits of correspondence, even what looked like an envelope marked confidential. The police wrote it off as storm debris entanglement. But Laura, my attorney, didn't believe that. Neither did I. We went through every remaining document salvaged from the water, fragments of HOA communications, financial records, and internal memos. What we found made my blood run cold. Hanley had been warned, not just by engineers, but by his own board. Multiple emails from construction managers outlined the danger of building over the wetlands. One even said, "The soil won't hold under high saturation. It's not a matter of if it collapses, but when." Hanley ignored them all. In fact, days before the flood, he signed off on a secret insurance claim, a massive policy that would pay out millions in the event of a natural disaster. It looked less like negligence and more like premeditation. He knew the road would fail. He knew people would lose their homes. But he expected a profit from it. And now he was dead in a way that seemed far too poetic to be random. The deeper we looked, the darker it got. The HOA's finances were riddled with inconsistencies, unexplained transfers, missing funds, offshore accounts. Hanley had been siphoning money from community fees for years, using shell companies to mask the trail. When the flood came, his empire collapsed with him. But someone else had known. Someone had tied those cables around his wrists. Someone had stuffed those papers into his pockets. Someone had wanted the world to find his body that way, as evidence, as punishment, as a message. The storm had buried the truth, but it had also washed something sinister to the surface. In the weeks that followed, the county declared Maple Ridge a disaster zone. Homeowners were relocated. The highway project was officially abandoned. Federal investigators arrived, taking control of what was left. And as the mud dried and grass began to grow again, nature returned. Frogs croaked at dusk. Herons landed on the shallow pools. The air smelled clean again, earthy, alive. The wetlands were healing, but the people weren't. At night, I heard things. Strange sounds in the direction of the collapsed highway, the creaking of metal, the low rush of water, even when it hadn't rained. Some said it was just the ground settling. Others said it was something else, that the wetlands were restless, carrying memories of what had been done to them. Once, while walking near the ruins to take photos for a restoration group, I saw something that froze me where I stood. A shape, faint, distorted, standing in the fog by the water's edge. It looked like a man in a soak jacket, his outline blurred by mist. I blinked, and it was gone. Only ripples remained. I told myself it was exhaustion, trauma, nothing more. But as I turned back toward home, the faint sound of splashing followed me. Slow, deliberate. Hanley was dead, but his shadow still lingered over the wetlands, a reminder that what he built in greed had drowned in consequence. Laura tried to convince me to leave. "You've done what you could," she said. "Let the authorities handle the rest." But I couldn't. This land was more than soil and water to me. It was my family's legacy. And now it was a crime scene, too. A week later, new evidence surfaced. The coroner's report confirmed what we had suspected. Hanley hadn't drowned. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. He was already dead before the water took him. That revelation changed everything. The flood had claimed many things, but murder wasn't supposed to be one of them. The wetlands had become both witness and grave. And the question that haunted me most wasn't who killed Richard Hanley, but why now? Because if someone had taken justice into their own hands before the storm, maybe the flood wasn't the only retribution nature had delivered. After the coroner's report came out, the story that had already shocked the county turned into something else entirely. Not a tragedy, but a mystery. Hanley hadn't drowned. He'd been killed before the flood. And somewhere in the ruins of the HOA's eco-friendly highway, the truth was still buried. Investigators swarmed Maple Ridge again. Crime scene tape fluttered in the wind around the collapsed section of road. Drones hovered overhead, capturing the terrain now transformed by erosion. The wetlands were returning to life, but they also seemed to guard their secrets, a quiet defiance beneath the slow ripples of muddy water. I stayed on the sidelines at first, documenting everything from a distance for my channel. My videos had gone viral. People across the country were watching, demanding justice. But the attention also drew unwanted eyes, reporters, developers, even anonymous accounts spreading rumors. Some said Hanley's death was an inside job, that one of his own board members turned on him when the scandal broke. Others whispered about angry homeowners, families who'd lost everything in the flood and wanted revenge. But one theory unsettled me more than all the rest, that Hanley hadn't been murdered despite the storm, but because of it. The flood was coming. Someone had known that, and someone had used it to cover up a killing. One morning, as cleanup crews started removing the last pieces of asphalt, a worker flagged me down. "You'll want to see this," he said quietly, glancing around as if worried someone might overhear. He led me to a section near the edge of the broken highway, a place where the soil had shifted just enough to expose something metallic beneath the surface. It wasn't part of the road. It was a safe, rusty, dented, but intact. It took hours for the workers to haul it out. The lock was broken from impact, and inside was a mess of waterlogged papers, hard drives, and sealed envelopes. When I saw the HOA logo stamped across them, I knew this was what Hanley had died for. Authorities took possession immediately, but Laura managed to get access through the injunction still active in our environmental case. What we found inside confirmed every suspicion and revealed something far darker. The documents showed that Hanley and two board members had secretly diverted HOA funds to a private development company. Their plan wasn't just to build a road. It was to sell the entire wetland tract to a commercial buyer once the community access route was complete. They had falsified environmental clearances, bribed inspectors, and forged permits. There were even emails from a local contractor warning them about sinkage risk and soil collapse under prolonged saturation. The same warnings they ignored. But among the files was something else, something handwritten, a journal, Hanley's journal. The entries started mundane, meeting notes, budgets, deadlines. But then, a few pages in, the tone changed. The writing became erratic, desperate. "The ground is moving again. The engineers say it's fine, but I can feel it shifting under the concrete. Someone keeps leaving letters at my door. No name. No return address. Just one line each time. You buried more than land. They know. Whoever it is, they know what we did." The last entry was dated the night before the flood. I hear water under the foundation. It's like something's breathing down there. I can't sleep. I think someone's coming. I remember staring at that last line, the pen mark dragged halfway across the page, as if the writer had been interrupted. Laura looked at me, her face pale. Someone killed him because he was about to confess. she said quietly, and they made sure the storm buried the evidence. But that meant the killer had known the flood would come days in advance. That wasn't possible unless they had manipulated the drainage systems. The thought sent a chill through me. The HOA's engineers had rerouted the creek flow when they built the road. They'd installed temporary holding basins and diversion pipes, all of which had been abandoned after the first collapse. But what if someone had tampered with them before the second storm? Someone who knew exactly how fragile the system was. Over the next week, I revisited the site every day. I watched as workers unearthed the broken drainage tunnels, as mudslides continued to shift the landscape. And then one evening, I saw something glinting in the fading light, half buried near the main culvert, just below the twisted remains of a steel barrier. It was a tool, a wrench, engraved with initials, BL. I recognized those letters instantly. They belonged to Brian Lanning, the HOA's lead contractor, one of the men who'd signed off on every illegal construction permit. He'd vanished 2 days after the flood, claiming to be helping family out of state. No one had seen him since. When I told Laura, she nodded grimly. If Brian tampered with the system, she said, then he didn't just cause a flood. He caused a murder and a cover-up. Authorities issued a warrant. The FBI got involved, classifying the case as environmental fraud and homicide. The quiet town of Willow Creek became the center of a national investigation. And while the wetlands slowly healed, the truth began to surface, like the water that had once swallowed everything. By early spring, the first regrowth appeared, cattails, lilies, frogs. The land was coming back, wild and alive, defying everything humans had done to it. But beneath its surface lay the bones of a highway, the rusted steel of greed, and the memory of one man's downfall. Every time I stood there, watching the sunrise shimmer on the water, I thought about what the wetlands had witnessed and what they'd taken back. Yet one thing still haunted me. Brian Lanning had disappeared, and deep down I knew he wasn't gone. He was hiding, waiting, and if nature had its way once, it would again. Because there's one truth you can't bury beneath concrete, lies, or water. When you take from the earth always takes back. Spring in Willow Creek should have been peaceful. The roads were clear, the wetlands green again, and the town tried to forget what had happened under the HOA's watch. But nature doesn't forget, and neither do the guilty. The first signs came quietly, small, almost invisible things that only I noticed. The soil near the reconstructed embankment started to sink again, little fissures spreading like veins beneath the grass. Frogs and birds vanished overnight. The air grew heavy, the way it does before a storm. And then one morning, I found fresh tire tracks cutting through the restricted construction zone. Someone had been there at night. When I followed the trail, it led straight to the same spot where we'd found the safe, the place where Hanley's secrets had surfaced. Someone had been digging there. The disturbed soil was still damp, and the air smelled of oil. At first, I thought scavengers were looking for leftover equipment, but the prints were deliberate. There were boot marks, one pair smaller than the others. Someone was working alone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Rain pattered against my window, soft at first, then heavier, steady, relentless, like a warning. The weather service had predicted light showers. But within hours, it turned into a full storm. Lightning carved across the sky. And that's when I saw him, through the sheets of rain, standing by the wetland's edge, a figure in a hooded jacket, head bent low, holding something metallic in one hand. He moved with purpose, checking the water channels, adjusting valves. It was Brian Lanning. I grabbed my camera and my phone and ran into the storm. The mud swallowed my boots. The wind tore through my jacket. But I kept filming. I had to get proof. Proof that he'd come back to destroy what was left. When I shouted his name, he froze. The flashlight in his hand flickered toward me, revealing a face hollowed by guilt and sleeplessness. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes said everything. The fear, the regret, the madness. He turned and bolted toward the culvert. I followed, my heart pounding louder than the thunder. The water was already rising fast, rushing through the half-collapsed pipes. Then I saw what he'd done. He'd reopened the old floodgates, the same ones the county had sealed after the disaster. Only this time, he'd rigged them to fail completely. The pressure in the holding basin was building by the second. "Brian," I shouted over the roar, "you'll kill us both." He shook his head. "It's already done," he yelled back, voice trembling. "This land was never meant to hold us. I thought I could fix it, but it's taking everything back." The ground rumbled underfoot. The retaining wall began to crack, a deep moan echoing from the earth itself. Water surged over the edge, churning black with debris. I stumbled backward as the first wave hit. Brian tried to climb the embankment, but the mud gave way. For a second, our eyes met, his filled with something between terror and acceptance. And then he was gone, swallowed by the flood. The current swept me off my feet next. I remember the cold shock, the crushing force dragging me under. Branches, stones, fragments of asphalt spun around me like shrapnel. I fought to reach the surface, gasping for air. When I finally pulled myself onto a fallen tree, the world was unrecognizable, just endless, roaring water under a flashing sky. Hours later, the storm broke. Dawn crept over what was left of Maple Ridge. The highway was gone again, buried under a brown, restless sea. Rescue teams found me at sunrise. They searched for Brian's body for days, but never recovered it. Some said the current carried him miles downstream. Others believed he sank into the mud, the same mud that had taken Hanley. The investigation ended with his name added to the list of the dead. But I never believed that was the end. Weeks passed, and the town began to rebuild once more. Nature returned quicker this time, reeds sprouting, birds nesting. But sometimes, standing on the new observation deck the county built, I'd see something in the distance, a figure on the far side of the marsh, still and silent. Always there when the mist was thickest. No one else ever saw him. They said I was seeing ghosts, that the trauma of the floods had blurred the line between truth and fear. Maybe they're right, but I know what I saw, and I know one thing for certain. Brian's work didn't die with him. The new wetland system, the one designed to restore natural balance, used his last blueprints. The same flawed design, the same unstable ground. They called it progress, another chance to live alongside nature instead of against it. But progress is a price. Last week, a local reporter sent me a photo. The water level had risen again, inches higher than it should have been. Pipes groaned beneath the surface. The earth trembled faintly, just like before the first collapse. The county says everything's safe. They always say that. But when I look out across that shimmering water, I swear I can still hear something beneath it. A faint hum like metal under tension. And sometimes when the wind shifts, I hear a voice echoing from the reeds. A voice whispering the same words Hanley wrote before he died. You buried more than land. Maybe it's just the past coming back. Maybe it's the earth remembering. Or maybe the wetlands are still watching, waiting for the next storm, the next lie, the next hand to reach where it shouldn't. Because in Willow Creek, one truth has never changed. The land doesn't forget, and the water always returns.